In this module, Module 1, Part 3, we're going to examine the possibility of alternative realities. You do see I have a question mark there because, of course, this is something that is controversial and problematic. But it's important in the study of ethnomedicine because many of the claims that are made, many of the cross-cultural claims that are made for healing and sickness etiology, etc., depend heavily on the existence of some sort of paranormal, supernatural, preternatural realm of spirits or forces that are acting outside our everyday realm. And so therefore it's an important question. It's an important question. And so we're going to take a look at it. First, let's look at supernaturalism and the hypothesis that there is a supernatural sphere of existence. Of course, virtually every religion accepts the existence of a supernatural realm in which can be found gods and spirits or demons and angels, etc. Shamans worldwide claim to be able to tap into, access, or visit this spirit realm. Of course, in our own culture, we have people like John Edward that claim to speak to the dead. Obviously, the dead are not here among us. They're somewhere else. Anyway, so the idea of alternative realities is quite important. So what about this notion of the supernatural? Well, again, we're probably talking about something that is not falsifiable, meaning that there's really no data that can be brought to bear on the topic to settle the dispute. So really, belief or disbelief in the supernatural is more a matter of taste than anything else. I suppose if one is raised in a very religious family, a religious environment, they will obviously have some predisposition toward believing that the supernatural is real. For those probably not so raised, that probably would not be the case. Critics point out, for example, the anthropologist James Lett, that the notion of the supernatural is nonsensical, since by definition we can't access it, we don't experience it, and we have no knowledge of it. And that would be the result of taking a strictly logical positivist approach. Logical positivism just simply deals with what we can measure, experience, document, etc. Other than that, we're just talking about empty claims. Basically, they apply the rule of falsifiability quite strictly, which just simply says that statements that are not falsifiable are meaningless. Not necessarily true or false, just simply meaningless. In other words, we can never really get at them. They just hang out there in this ether of uncertainty forever. And as I said, it becomes a matter of taste, whether or not one accepts or rejects the notion. So actually, in my own definition of culture, for example, in the textbook I just completed for Introduction to Anthropology, in my definition of religion in that textbook, I use the term paranormal instead of the term supernatural because the term supernatural is so problematic. Paranormal just refers to those events, occurrences, etc., that are just beyond our normal everyday mode of experiences. And so to me that seems to be a lot more grounded than things that are supposed to take place in some realm that by definition, as I said, we can't even access. So it's problematic for that reason. Again, we can't really determine whether or not a supernatural realm exists or does not exist, but we can certainly understand why the contention or the hypothesis that there is a supernatural realm is problematic. Next, let's take a look at trance, possession, spiritual travels, things of that nature. I've done quite a bit of work on spirit possession. In fact, my master's thesis was on spirit possession in the Orisha religion in Trinidad, that African-derived religion I study. And then in the book I published on African religions in the Caribbean, titled Spirits, Blood, and Drums, I have a chapter on spirit possession. And in fact, I ask you to read that chapter. That's reading 1, titled Spirits and Spirit Possession. We'll get to that in just a minute. But at this point, let me just note that spirit possession is a very real phenomenon cross-culturally. Now, what I mean by that is that it is a legitimate occurrence of what psychologists call dissociation. People are definitely not in their normal waking mode of consciousness. So they're not faked, they're not feigned, they are real. Actually, in Trinidad, I saw over 500 of them in a religious context. And they're very real, they're very legitimate. Now, that being said, as an anthropologist, I do not believe that we have to invoke the existence of spirits to understand what's going on, or to explain or interpret what's going on. The reason why anthropologists feel this way is because we can't privilege one culture. In other words, we can't accept one culture's spiritual ideology regarding their spirits and gods and possession experiences and so forth, while not accepting another. And in fact, as I mentioned, there are 10,500 different religions out there and all sorts of understandings regarding how many gods there are, the nature of God or these gods. Possession experiences differ. They just run the gamut from sort of a trance type behavior to a sort of behavior where they totally lose motor control. So actually privileging one culture's insider's explanation regarding spirit possession would be problematic for that reason. What do we do with all the others? Okay, let's take a look at the paper, this reading 1, Spirits and Spirit Possession. And I'm assuming you've done the reading. You may want to have a copy of it in front of you as we go through it. In the first part of the article, I talk quite a bit about the pantheon, which is the family of gods and spirits that are recognized by any one group. And there is an extensive pantheon that is recognized in the Orisha religion. And I spend the first few pages discussing them and the way that people actually deal with them. Some tend to be splitters, and they see lots of different kind of spirits. Some tend to be lumpers, and they lump these groups up into 1 or 2 categories. Let's look first at page 115, where I focus in on the fact that spirit possession is a manifestly cultural phenomenon. When I use that term, when I say cultural, what I mean is that it is one thing one place and quite something else in another. What's happening here differs and is distinctive from group to group. Look at the paragraph right below the block quote on page 115 and read with me. It seems plausible that old religions indigenous to a particular area would be associated with many spirits whose personality attributes are socially and culturally meaningful. Articles of faith notwithstanding, the form and substance of religion is largely predicated on a complex assortment of political, social, economic, and historical factors. Thus, it is easy to understand why, say, the Fan peoples of Benin and the Yoruba of southern Nigeria conceive of the Voodoo and the Orisha, respectively, these are spirits and gods, in terms that are familiar to them, and that these spirits manifest in culturally meaningful ways by expressing themselves, whether in language, dance, or other activities, in a familiar and culturally appropriate manner. These pantheons are, after all, affiliated with religious systems that have undergone centuries of indigenous development. Just in general, you may recall from some comments made in one of the earlier modules, religion is looked at as being a functional phenomenon. It is basically a unique and distinctive fit for one particular place, one particular people, one particular culture. If we turn the page, page 116, here I get into the issue of the etiology of spirit possession. So what causes it? What are the origins of it? How does it begin? How does it manifest itself? So the etiology of spirit possession. And the first thing I want to do is discuss an issue of terminology. Anthony Wallace, bottom of page 116, raises a very good point. Read with me his quote, bottom page 116. Casual observers and many anthropologists alike use this word, possession, in two very different senses, as a label for some person's overtly observable behavior and as a label for a native theory to explain this behavior. These two uses are unhappily often confused. It may be best to state flatly at the outset that I will use the word possession to denote any native theory which explains some event of human behavior as being the result of the physical presence in a human body of an alien spirit which takes over certain or all of the host's executive functions. Well, I totally agree with Wallace, and I too will try to use the term possession to refer to the native theory that there are spirits that actually displace the soul or the spirit of the individual and take over their body, at least temporarily. And I will reserve the term dissociation for the actual behavior. So we know, in fact, that dissociation is occurring. That's a psychological term that could be used. Whether or not possession, the term possession, should be invoked is a matter of dispute. Anthropologists tend, in fact, not to invoke the hypothesis that possession behavior or dissociation can be attributed to possession by some spiritual entity. So we'll make that distinction. As far as the different quote-unquote scientific explanations that have been offered, on page 118 I explore a few from the top, fourth line down. For example, I note that Michelle and Michelle view spirit possession as a medium through which repressed needs and impulses can be satisfied. Two other scholars, Ward and Bobrin, postulate a link between stress and possession. These are psychological explanations. In the next paragraph, I discuss biochemical/physiological approaches. One interesting one begins in the fifth line, noting the preponderance of women in groups that practice spirit possession. Kehoe and Giletti write that possession, at least in regard to women, may be causally associated with sumptuary roles and economic patterns that limit women's access to adequately balanced nutrition, particularly the nutritional needs of pregnant and lactating women. Well, that's pretty fascinating. So they're talking about some sort of nutritional deficiency here. But that doesn't help us with males, nor does it really help us with women who are not suffering from some nutritional deficiency. In the next paragraph, there's an interesting approach given to us by Andrew Nair. And you can see that he associates dissociation with drumbeat frequency and alpha wave rhythms of the brain. In fact, he argues that dissociation or possession occurs when the drumbeat frequencies fall in the range of 7 to 9 cycles per second, a frequency that corresponds to alpha wave rhythms. Interesting hypothesis. And then finally, the next paragraph, socio-political approaches tend to focus on possession as the means by which socially repressed persons may improve their plight. Well, actually, these are fascinating and compelling, but they're all wanting in some sense. None of them are comprehensive, and no single one of these will explain this very diverse and sophisticated phenomenon referred to as spirit possession. I will say, though, on page 121 that I do point out that enculturation appears to be a significant component of the whole spirit possession complex. Enculturation is the process whereby a person learns his or her culture. As noted on page 122 and page 123, I noticed that those worshipers that were more experienced and older had smoother possession experiences. In other words, they had possession experiences that were more culturally proper, quote unquote, that were a better fit to the cultural understanding of possession. On the other hand, young people or neophytes, people who had just joined the religion, have very chaotic, almost hysterical dissociative episodes. And I attribute this to enculturation. So somehow, some way, this seems to be a factor. The extent to which someone has internalized their culture seems to allow them to affect a proper possession experience. Well, so what do the insiders say? Well, the insiders say that possession is caused by spirits entering the head of the individual, at which point in time they will displace the original soul or spirit of the individual, and when the spirit leaves, the body is momentarily without an animating spirit or soul. And in fact, it's interesting to note that when the possession is over, the individual does pass out, and they lie them on a bench, and it takes probably 10-15 minutes to a half hour for them to actually kind of shake it off and wake up and get back to their old self. And they explain that as being due to the fact that it takes a while for their soul to make it back to them. And theoretically, if the soul did not make it back to them, then they would die. Well, so we haven't really settled anything here, other than the fact that spirit possession is a very real cross-cultural phenomenon that we do not necessarily need to invoke the existence of spirits to understand. But it's not feigned, it's not faked. It's a very real phenomenon and quite fascinating. One other stop here, and this is with the other reading that I had you do for this module, this other article reading, reading 2. And this is actually chapter 1 in that same book called Orisha Experiences. And here I will direct your attention to my initiation in the Orisha religion. And this is described on page 14 and 15. This initiation began Sunday afternoon when I was bathed and ritually bathed and placed in a hut where I would stay with my head wrapped up until Tuesday morning, during which time I basically fasted. And it's a classic sort of sensory deprivation kind of ordeal. Tuesday morning I was brought up and the ritual proper took place. It lasted 4 or 5 hours. And as you read, during that time I had a pretty strong vision. I really don't know how to explain it other than at one point in time during the ceremony, I looked down into a calabash that I was supposed to drink out of, and I had an amazing vision. At the time, though, I knew it wasn't real. I knew it was happening between my ears, probably because of my training as an anthropologist, I don't know. But I can say that, I really wasn't in my right mind at the time. I had had virtually no sleep and no food from basically Sunday afternoon to Tuesday morning. And I was under a great deal of stress. Frankly, the ordeal was somewhat frightening, as you might guess. And so I attribute that experience to the fact that I was really at a time of great stress and fear and anxiety. But nevertheless, I had a legitimate vision. And it's always been interesting to me that this vision was culturally meaningful to the people I worked with. It wasn't some random thing I just dreamed up. In other words, when I explained it to the people I worked with, they said, yeah, that makes sense, and we can tell you what it means. So, that is my one foray into alternative realities. Although, as I said, I know for a fact this was happening between my ears and not out in reality, because I confirmed that later with the people that were around me. And this basically sort of supports my own theory that many of the paranormal phenomenon that people claim to experience are probably happening, in fact, between their ears subjectively rather than out in the world objectively. And we'll revisit this from time to time throughout the semester.